We were just a bunch of naive kids, too clueless to realize how reckless we were. There was me, Noah, along with my friends Jake, Sam, and Maddie. Our small group had a reputation for getting into trouble in the quiet little town we called home, nestled on the outskirts of nowhere. Winters there were brutal, the kind that turned your breath into clouds and froze your bones, but we never let it stop us. Back then, we thought we were invincible. Even with all the warnings at school about people going missing, we brushed it off like it could never happen to us. Stuff like that happened to other people, not us. One afternoon, as we were walking home from school, Jake got that mischievous look in his eye, the one that always meant trouble. "Let's check out that creepy old house at the edge of town," he said with a grin. Everyone knew about the place. It was infamous. Years ago, it had belonged to some guy who turned out to be a serial killer. They'd found out after he died, but the stories about him never seemed to fade. I hated the idea immediately. Something about it just felt wrong. But, of course, the dares started flying, and I caved. I always did. When we got to the house, it was even worse than I imagined. The windows were sealed with rotting planks, and inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Everything looked like it had been frozen in time: broken chairs, an old couch, and wallpaper so faded it was peeling in long, jagged strips. The silence in that house wasn't normal. It felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to come closer. It didn't take long for us to start getting bored. That's when Jake, in his typical fearless fashion, said, "Let's see what's in the basement." My gut twisted, warning me to stay back, but I followed them anyway. The stairs creaked and groaned under our weight as we made our way into the darkness. Our flashlights barely lit the way, but when they did, we saw some seriously weird stuff: books scattered everywhere, strange symbols scrawled on the walls and floor, like something straight out of a horror movie. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe those stories about the killer weren't just small-town gossip. Maybe he'd been into something way worse. We stood there, debating whether to leave or keep exploring, when everything went sideways. One second Jake was standing beside me, and the next, he crumpled to the ground. No warning, no sound, he just dropped. Before I could even process what happened, Sam fell too, his body hitting the floor like dead weight. Maddie gasped, clutching her chest, and collapsed soon after. My heart was racing as panic took hold, but before I could make a move, my legs gave out. My vision blurred, and then, nothing. When I finally came to, a blinding, flickering light stung my eyes. My entire body ached, and as I tried to move, I realized my wrists were shackled. A surge of panic jolted through me. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the others, Jake, Sam, and Maddie, chained to the wall beside me. They were awake too, their faces pale with fear. Jake broke the silence first. "I'm starving," he murmured, his voice cracking. Sam groaned in agreement. I tried to steady my voice as I asked, "Where are we?" No one answered. The only sound was the creak of footsteps from above. The basement door creaked open, and down the stairs came a figure. My stomach dropped. It was him, the serial killer we all thought was long gone. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollow and dark, but he was alive. Very much alive. "Good morning, kids," he rasped, his voice a low, menacing growl that made my skin crawl. Jake screamed, "You're supposed to be dead. You can't be real." Maddie's voice cracked, her panic spilling out. The man's lips curled into a sinister grin, his teeth yellowed and sharp. "Dead?" he said, almost laughing. "Death is afraid of me. Even the devil does my bidding." What happened next was worse than any horror I could have dreamed up in my worst nightmares. The man, this monster, started talking, sharing every gruesome detail of his so-called rituals. He told us about the sacrifices, the murders, and the sick devotion he had to something darker than death itself. His words were horrifying, a twisted confession of years of terror and bloodshed. I begged him, pleaded with every ounce of strength I had, to let us go. But he only smiled, that same cold, heartless grin. "You must be starving," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Then, he tossed the knife onto the floor in front of us. "Feed yourselves." Without another word, he turned and left. The sound of the door locking behind him echoed through the basement like the final nail in a coffin. I lost track of time after that. Days? Weeks? It all blurred together. Hunger clawed at us like a rabid animal, gnawing away at any shred of strength or hope we had left. There was a small, boarded-up window in the basement, but it was useless. Our chains weren't bolted to the floor, but no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't escape the room. It was Ezekiel who broke first. His body just gave out, and he collapsed, struggling for air until, finally, he was gone. The starvation was unbearable. Jake was the one who finally said what none of us dared to think. He looked at Ezekiel's lifeless body, his voice low and shaky. "We have to survive," he muttered, gripping the knife with trembling hands. This is the only way." I screamed at him, yelling that he was insane, but he didn't care. He was desperate. He cut into Ezekiel's flesh, and before I could stop him, he started drinking the blood. The metallic smell filled the room, making Maddie and me retch in the corner. But over time, the hunger won. It always did. Jake offered us pieces of Ezekiel, and though I swore I would never sink that low, I did. We both did. Time lost meaning after that. The days melted into weeks, and the room became a disgusting, rotting mess, blood smeared on the floor, the air thick with the stench of decay. One day, I woke to a chilling sight. Jake was unconscious, and Maddie was standing, unchained. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow, like she wasn't even there anymore. "I'm going to find help," she said in a monotone voice that didn't sound like her at all. She climbed the stairs, moving like she was in a trance. I thought for just a moment that she might make it. But halfway up, something invisible threw her backward. Her body slammed into the ground, and I heard the sickening crack as her neck snapped. I screamed her name, over and over, but Jake didn't wake up. It was just me now, alone in that nightmare, starving, terrified, and losing my mind. It must have been months since we first disappeared. I didn't want to die, but the hunger was relentless. It took over. With trembling hands, I picked up the blood-stained knife and turned it on my friends. I hated myself for it, but survival was the only thing that mattered anymore. Eventually, the old man came back. He stood in the doorway, watching me with that same sick satisfaction. "You've done well," he said, his voice filled with eerie pride. "You're ready now." "Ready for what?" I didn't wait to find out. The moment he turned his back, I lunged at him, plunging the knife deep into his spine. He let out a low, guttural sound and crumpled to the floor. I didn't stay to see if he'd get back up. My legs carried me to the stairs faster than I thought possible. I grabbed the door handle, fully expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. It swung open with ease. That's when it hit me, like a blow to the chest. The door had never been locked. Not once. We could have escaped at any time. We were so blinded by fear, so consumed by hopelessness, that we never even tried. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. When I finally stumbled through the door, tears streaming down my face, I collapsed into my parents' arms. But they didn't believe me. No one did. They said I'd been missing for 5 years. 5 years gone just like that. The police searched the house I told them about, but they didn't find anything. No blood. No bodies. No signs that anyone had ever been there. Now I'm here, sitting in a psychiatric hospital, writing this all down. Everyone says I'm crazy, but I know the truth. He's still out there. The man who cheated death. And I know it's only a matter of time before he comes back for me. I had this nightmare, a horrifying dream that unearthed a dark secret about my mother. But when I woke up, she was nowhere to be found. I remember waking with the kind of headache that felt like a hammer pounding inside my skull. At first, I didn't even want to open my eyes. The discomfort beneath me, cold and unyielding, was what finally forced me to stir. It felt like I was sitting on bare metal, no pillow or cushion, just this hard, biting surface. When I tried to stand, my head slammed into cold metal bars. That's when it hit me. I was trapped inside a dog cage. Completely naked, my body was covered in deep, raw scratches that stung with every move I made. The air reeked of decay, thick and nauseating, and the place was alive with moths flitting through the dim light. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the walls, coated with mold, black and green, creeping like veins. There were tables and shelves everywhere, cluttered with jars, books, and strange objects I couldn't even begin to name. The floor was a nightmare all on its own, smeared with blood and scattered with body parts. Fingers, eyes, testicles. They lay in grotesque disarray, and the muddy boot prints trailed through it all like some macabre signature. I was frozen, terrified out of my mind. My instinct was to scream, but something deep inside told me to stay quiet. I didn't want to alert anyone, or anything, that might still be here. My eyes darted around, desperate for something, anything, and that's when I saw it, a key, just lying on the floor near the cage. Without thinking, I grabbed it, fumbling with shaky hands to unlock the latch. The moment I was free, I slipped out and threw on a coat I found draped over a chair nearby. That's when I noticed it. Out of the corner of my eye, a surveillance camera was perched in the room's corner, its cold, glassy eye pointed directly at me. My stomach churned. Panic set in, and I bolted for the door. But when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Locked. I searched frantically, tearing through the shelves and tables for something, anything, that could help me escape. But nothing worked. Then I spotted a knife. It was large, jagged, with a hooked edge on the back that looked like it was made to stick in flesh and not let go. My heart pounded as I grabbed it, and crouched behind one of the tables, gripping the blade tightly. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I felt it in my gut, something was coming. And then it happened. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, growing louder. The door creaked open, and in it rolled something I can't unsee. It wasn't human. It had the head of a man, pale and lifeless, perched on top of a machine, a white medical device with a screen and buttons. It moved on 4 wheels, and at each corner were metal rods. One of those rods held a bag of fluid dripping into the man's neck through a tube. On either side of the machine were mechanical arms, but they ended in human hands, complete with veins and nerves that fed into the device. The face of the man, the head, was blank, emotionless. Its dead eyes scanned the room, taking everything in as it rolled further inside. And though I was shaking, fear coursing through every inch of me, I attacked. With all the strength I had, I lunged, shoving the machine over. It crashed to the ground, shattering on impact. Blood poured from the device, pooling beneath it, and the man's head rolled off, wires and veins trailing behind like grotesque ribbons. For a split second, his lifeless eyes locked with mine, and in them, I swear I saw gratitude, as if he were silently saying, "Thank you?" I didn't wait around. I ran. Sprinting through dimly lit, filthy corridors, some of them pitch dark, others flickering with sickly light. The hallways reeked, cluttered with broken junk, bloody smears, and pieces of things I didn't want to think about. My feet crunched over remains until I stumbled into another room, and froze. There he was, sitting on an operating table. He looked young, maybe in his 20s, with jet black hair and a round face. His cheeks and lips were unnervingly red, and his dark brown eyes pierced right through me. He wore a sweater, and on his right hand, a glove tipped with long, razor-sharp metal claws. In front of him lay a woman. She was awake but couldn't scream. Her jaw was dislocated, her throat exposed. He was toying with her vocal cords, gently plucking at them with the claws, as if playing some twisted instrument. His cold gaze shifted to me, and a smug smile crept across his face. He pulled his hand away from the woman's throat and spoke, his voice soft and warm, almost comforting. "Don't worry," he said. "I've learned you're not related to her. One of my creations already annulled that bond. You're not like her. You're not corrupt." I don't remember what happened next. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my own bed, in my own room. But it wasn't just a dream. I know it wasn't. I sat up, frantically checking my body. The scratches were gone, but my mind screamed that what I'd seen was real. I called out for my mother, my voice trembling, but there was no answer. That's when it hit me. The woman from the nightmare, the one on the operating table, she looked just like my mother. I ran to her room and burst in. She wasn't there. The only thing I found was spray painted on the wall behind her bed, bright red letters that read, "She wasn't your mother, she just adopted you to make money off of you." My breath caught as I noticed something smaller scrawled beneath the message in faint letters. A single word, Mikalo. In a small, dimly lit room, a man named Ethan, 35, slouched over a half-empty bottle of bourbon. The amber liquid stared back at him like a challenge. It sent a bitter reminder of the endless cycle he couldn't seem to break. His hands shook as he tried to resist its pull, but the smooth curve of the bottle's neck seemed to taunt him, daring him to give in. Ethan's complexion was pale and sickly, his bloodshot eyes a testament to nights spent battling his demons. His hair, once neatly kept, now hung in greasy, tangled strands around his face. The room itself reflected his state of being, shared housing in a rundown neighborhood where the walls carried the weight of his struggles. The air inside reeked of stale cigarettes and sour sweat, faintly masked by the sharp tang of disinfectant he'd half-heartedly sprayed earlier in a feeble attempt to mask the stench of his addiction. On the other side of the thin wall, the laughter of his neighbors broke the silence every night. A retired old man named George and a young woman named Emily cackled loudly, their boisterous voices seeping through the fragile barrier like water through cracks. Ethan's ears, finely tuned from years of straining to hear his ex-wife's footsteps late at night, picked up every sound, every laugh, every shuffle of feet. Their carefree banter became a constant irritation, each laugh twisting the knife of his loneliness a little deeper. Desperation bubbled up in him, and when the noise grew unbearable, he banged on the wall, his voice cracking as he begged them to stop. But instead of quiet, their laughter grew louder, crueler, almost mocking. One night, after enduring yet another evening of their incessant noise, Ethan finally snapped. His bloodshot eyes glowed with a fiery determination as he stumbled into the tiny kitchen. His thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, frustration, and pain as he grabbed the largest knife he could find. Its cold steel felt solid and reassuring in his trembling hand. Fueled by bourbon and rage, he crept into a hallway, each step a deliberate act of rebellion against everything he'd suffered. The old floorboards groaned beneath him, almost as if trying to hold him back. George's door was slightly open, allowing the flickering light of a television to spill into the dark hallway. Ethan paused, taking a shaky breath, before nudging the door open with his free hand. The room was in shambles. Empty beer cans and takeout boxes were scattered across the floor, the remnants of a life lived carelessly. George lay on his bed, snoring heavily, oblivious to the storm brewing inches away. Ethan felt an eerie calm wash over him as he stepped closer to the old man. With a swift motion, he brought the knife down. The blade sliced cleanly into George's neck, and a fountain of blood erupted, painting the walls and floor in violent streaks of red. The snoring stopped abruptly, replaced by a wet, gurgling sound that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. But his face remained blank, detached from the horror of what he'd done. The eerie blue glow of the TV reflected off the blood pooling on the floor, casting ghostly shadows that flickered on the walls. Ethan stepped over George's limp body and moved down the hallway, his breathing slow and steady, his pulse racing with adrenaline. He stopped in front of Emily's door, this one closed. The muffled thump of music seeped through, a jarring contrast to the silence in George's room. Ethan's grip on the knife tightened as he turned the doorknob and stepped inside. Emily was lounging on her couch, her eyes glued to a reality show blaring on the TV. She didn't even notice him at first. When she finally looked up, her eyes widened in terror at the sight of Ethan standing there, the knife in his hand gleaming under the TV's strobe-like glow. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound never came. Ethan lunged forward, plunging the knife into her chest. The blade sank deep, and Emily staggered back, collapsing onto the couch as the life drained from her wide, panicked eyes. The television continued to blare, the canned laughter of the show echoing cruelly in the room. Ethan stood over her, panting heavily, his hand still gripping the knife, now slick with blood. The glowing numbers on the digital clock caught his eye, 3:47 a.m. The house was silent now, the kind of silence he had longed for. He turned off the TV, leaving the room in a deafening quiet. With unsteady hands, he began dismantling the couch cushions, tearing into them to expose the stuffing. He dragged George's body into the room, his muscles straining against the dead weight. George's head lolled to one side, his open mouth a grotesque mirror of the chaos Ethan had unleashed. He worked methodically, his movements careful and precise, as if this was all part of some grim plan. He shoved the cushions into George's throat, pressing down until the blood flow slowed to a sluggish trickle. Then, he wrapped Emily's body in a stained blanket, the fabric sticking to her skin like a morbid shroud. The room seemed to close in on him, the metallic tang of blood thickening the air. Ethan stood back, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. His mind raced, calculating how to make this look like an accident, some tragic mishap that wouldn't lead back to him. He grabbed a t-shirt from the floor and wiped the knife clean, his heart pounding as he stepped back into the hallway. He left the door ajar, allowing just enough light to spill into the corridor, then retreated to his own room. The whiskey bottle sat beside his armchair, a silent witness to the chaos he had unleashed. He stared at it, his hollow eyes betraying the storm raging within. The laughter that had haunted him was gone, replaced by a suffocating quiet. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to peace. Twisted, dark, and fleeting, but peace nonetheless. With dawn still hours away, Ethan grabbed cleaning supplies and returned to the bloodied room. He scrubbed furiously, the sound of his breathing echoing in his ears as the water in the sink swirled red. The blood disappeared down the drain, but the memories remained, etched into his mind like scars. Ethan knew that the world would soon awaken, dragging with it the harsh reality of what he had done. But for now, in the still quiet of the early morning, he felt like the master of his own twisted narrative, the conductor of a macabre symphony that only he could hear. The sun would rise, and the weight of his actions would come crashing down, but until then, he had a story to craft, a version of events to twist into something plausible. The whiskey bottle sat untouched beside him, a mute witness to the battle he had fought and the line he had crossed. The cleanup became a grim ritual, a meticulous dance of rags and disinfectant. Every drop of blood was a confession, every smear a reminder of his crime. Ethan scrubbed with ferocious determination, his arms moving in a relentless rhythm. The floorboards, once a canvas for the crimson chaos, now gleamed with an unsettling cleanliness that felt like a lie. The acrid stench of bleach burned his nostrils, a stark counterpoint to the sickly metallic tang that still lingered in the air. Once the room was scoured of evidence, he dragged the couch cushions into the kitchen, Larry's lifeless body still resting on top of them. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a hauntingly normal sound in the aftermath of what he'd done. Ethan paused for a moment, staring at the cushions, his stomach knotting. On a strange impulse, he reached into the fridge and grabbed a half-eaten sandwich. As he took a bite, the bland taste of bread and mayo grounded him, a bizarre comfort against the chaos swirling in his mind. It was proof that he was still alive, still in control. The first rays of dawn began to peek through the cracks in the kitchen blinds, casting the room in a faint pinkish hue. Ethan inhaled deeply, the air finally feeling lighter though it was still tinged with the heaviness of his deeds. He convinced himself it was necessary. Now came the next step, making it look like something else. Wrapping Larry's body in the torn couch cushions, he secured the bundle with duct tape, winding it tightly until the corpse was hidden inside a grotesque cocoon. Larry's glazed eyes stared up at him one last time, their silent judgment gnawing at Ethan's resolve. Avoiding their gaze, he hefted the bundle onto his shoulder, grunting under its weight as he made his way to the dilapidated basement. The basement was a graveyard of forgotten belongings, broken chairs, old trunks, and water-stained walls. In the far corner, Ethan spotted an ancient, rusted bathtub. He placed Larry's body inside, arranging the limbs with an almost delicate care, as though granting the man some final dignity. Next came Tiffany. Her body was far lighter, her youthful frame easier to manage. Ethan worked with chilling precision, the knife slicing through her flesh with an efficiency that horrified him even as he continued. He stuffed her remains into a large black plastic bag, the kind meant for raking leaves, and placed it beside Larry in the tub. The water heater sputtered to life when Ethan twisted the knob, its low groan filling the damp air. He crouched by the tub, watching the dial with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. Steam began to rise, curling in the dim light, filling the basement with a stifling humidity that clung to his skin. His hand hesitated on the faucet, the enormity of his actions pressing down on him like a lead weight. After a moment's pause, he turned the knob, watching the water slowly fill the tub. The sound was almost peaceful, a cruel irony as Larry's body shifted in the rising water, a macabre puppet in a silent, final act. Ethan stepped back, his chest heaving as the waterline climbed, tinged pink before deepening into a murky red. His stomach churned at the sight, but he swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He retreated to his room to gather his thoughts, leaving the tub to fill. The whiskey bottle glinted from the floor, its presence both a temptation and a warning. He ignored it, knowing his mind needed to stay sharp. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he began piecing together an alibi. The house was old, the plumbing notoriously unreliable. A burst pipe. A tragic accident. It was plausible. It had to be plausible. Returning to the basement, Ethan found the water had turned thick and viscous, the cushions floating like grotesque rafts on the surface. Gritting his teeth, he plunged his hands into the warm liquid, working quickly to tie knots and secure the scene. The cushions were heavy with blood, their weight a sobering reminder of what he'd done. The water sloshed over the edges, staining the floorboards a deep, angry maroon. Ethan's fingers moved with mechanical precision, but his mind reeled, a hurricane of thoughts and emotions swirling just beneath the surface. He avoided Larry's face entirely, focusing instead on the task at hand. The old man's body bobbed in the water, his features twisted into a grotesque grimace that Ethan couldn't bring himself to look at. Each motion, every knot tied, every piece secured, was an act of survival, a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of his actions. The basement was silent save for the soft lapping of water against the tub's sides. Ethan stepped back, his arms dripping with the blood-tainted water. The reality of what he'd done clawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced it down, burying it beneath the calm, methodical facade he'd constructed. There was no going back now. He had to finish what he'd started. With one final heave, Ethan hauled the makeshift bundle into the alley behind the building. The dumpster was already overflowing with trash, pizza boxes, crumpled beer cans, and the remnants of another night in a city that never slept. He tossed the soggy cushions inside, the weight of them landing with a dull, lifeless thud. Wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, he stepped back to take in the scene. The alley was quiet, save for the distant wail of a siren, its mournful tone a fitting soundtrack to his night of horrors. The sun had fully risen now, casting jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. Time was no longer his ally. Ethan took one last look at the dumpster, a grotesque monument to the desperate chaos of his actions, before hurrying back inside. His pulse hammered in his ears, each beat a whispered confession. But there was no turning back. The line had been crossed, the story rewritten. As he closed the basement door behind him, he couldn't help but wonder what was waiting for him in the next chapter. Would someone uncover the truth? Would his neighbor's laughter ever torment him again? Or would guilt consume him, transforming this fleeting moment of victory into an eternal prison? The house was eerily still, the silence almost oppressive in the absence of Larry and Emily's presence. Ethan trudged to the bathroom and turned on the shower. The scalding water poured over him as he scrubbed at his skin, the motions mechanical and frantic, as though he could wash away the night itself. Blood swirled down the drain, a grim reminder of his sins. By the time he stepped out, the air was thick with steam, clinging to his skin as if it carried the weight of his guilt. He toweled off and reached for clean clothes, the fabric sticking to his damp skin like a second, suffocating layer. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the stillness like a blade, freezing him in place. His hand tightened around the towel, which slipped from his grasp and crumpled to the floor. The bell rang again, sharper this time, more insistent. Panic surged through him. Whoever was on the other side of the door could be anyone. The police, a curious neighbor, or worse, someone who knew. But there was no hiding from this moment. Ethan had made his move, and now he had to face the fallout. He threw on a shirt and pants, the damp fabric clinging to his body, and took a deep breath. Each step down the stairs felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was conspiring to keep him from reaching the door. When he finally got there, he paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, he thought about not answering, but that wasn't an option. Steeling himself, he turned the knob and pulled the door open, squinting into the bright light of a new day. A delivery man stood on the porch, holding a box that seemed far too ordinary for the chaos swirling in Ethan's mind. "Got a package for you," the man said casually, adjusting the box under one arm. "Looks like a new TV or something. Sign here." Ethan blinked, his mind struggling to process the mundanity of the moment. The clipboard was thrust toward him, and he took it with trembling hands, scrawling his name in jagged letters. Each movement felt surreal, like he was performing some twisted pantomime of normalcy. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The delivery man handed over the box with a nod and turned to leave, completely unfazed by the shadow of unease that seemed to radiate from Ethan. As the door clicked shut behind him, Ethan leaned against it, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared at the box in his hands, the weight of it grounding him in a reality he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. He carried the package to the kitchen table and set it down, his movements slow and deliberate. The sun streamed through the blinds, its golden light falling on the floorboards he had worked so hard to clean. But there it was, a faint smear of blood, a detail he had overlooked in his frenzy. A fresh wave of panic gripped him, and he grabbed a cloth, dropping to his knees as he scrubbed at the spot with frantic energy. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the silence of the house amplifying every creak and scrape. No matter how hard he scrubbed, though, he couldn't shake the feeling that the stain wasn't just on the floor, it was on him. Eventually, he stopped, sitting back on his heels as the silence pressed in from all sides. The house felt larger now, the emptiness stretching out into every corner. It struck him that as much as he had hated the sound of Larry and Emily's laughter, it had been a reminder that life existed outside of his own misery. Now, there was only quiet, a suffocating void that seemed to mock him. His eyes wandered to the box on the table. Its bright, colorful branding felt out of place in the muted chaos of the room. Hoping for a distraction, Ethan ripped it open, his hands moving with a restless urgency. Inside was a sleek, flat-screen TV, the kind that might have once excited him. But now, it felt meaningless. He pulled it out, setting it up with mechanical precision, but the act felt hollow. The flashing screen and polished edges couldn't fill the gaping void left by what he'd done. The silence returned, heavier now, and Ethan sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV. His hands rested on his knees, still trembling slightly, as he tried to quiet the thoughts swirling in his head. The laughter was gone, and with it, any semblance of normalcy. What replaced it wasn't peace. It was emptiness, a heavy, all-consuming void that he knew no amount of distractions could fill. Ethan sat in front of the television, its flickering screen casting restless shadows over his face. He flipped through the channels, the hum of voices and static washing over him like white noise. But his mind wasn't on the shows. Instead, it replayed the events of the night over and over, like a broken film reel he couldn't shut off. He could still hear Larry's gurgling last breaths, still see the sheer terror frozen in Emily's wide eyes as he lunged at her. The sharp chime of the doorbell jolted him from his dark reverie. His heart lurched, and a heavy weight settled in his gut. Slowly, hesitantly, he stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The doorbell rang again, insistent and unyielding, amplifying his unease. Who would be here so early? Panic surged through his veins as he approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He opened the door just enough to see who it was. Standing there was a police officer, her expression calm but concerned. "Good morning, sir," she said, her tone even but probing. "We're conducting a welfare check. Some neighbors reported hearing a disturbance last night. Is everything all right?" Ethan's throat went dry, his mouth refusing to form words for a moment. He forced himself to swallow, his mind scrambling for an answer. Yeah? Everything's fine," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "It was just some loud music. You know how thin these walls are." He managed a weak, nervous chuckle, though it felt alien coming from his lips. The officer tilted her head, her sharp eyes scanning him. A few people mentioned hearing screaming, she said, her voice firm but not accusing. Are you sure everything's okay? He could feel his pulse pounding in his neck. Screaming? He repeated, trying to sound surprised. No screaming. Maybe someone else in the building. But I'll keep the music down. Sorry about that. Her gaze lingered on him, her brow furrowing slightly as though she were trying to piece together an unseen puzzle. All right, she said eventually. Let us know if you hear or see anything unusual. It can get rowdy in buildings like this. Of course, Ethan replied, his forced smile twitching at the edges. Thanks for checking in. She nodded but didn't immediately leave. Instead, she studied him for another moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. You look a little pale, sir. Are you feeling all right? Ethan's palms were clammy as he waved her concern away. Yeah, just tired, he said quickly, his voice tight. Long night, that's all. With a final glance, the officer turned and walked away, her boots crunching on the gravel of the front path. Ethan shut the door slowly, leaning his weight against it as a wave of relief washed over him. But it was fleeting. The encounter lingered in his mind like a shadow, a reminder that he wasn't as invisible as he wanted to believe. He glanced toward the box on the kitchen table, the television behind him casting a soft glow across the room. The guilt and fear coiled around him like a noose, squeezing tighter with every passing second. He had gotten away with it, this time, but how long could he keep up the charade? The walls felt closer, their silence whispering accusations he couldn't drown out. Ethan began to pace the room, his thoughts racing as he tried to come up with a plan. He needed an alibi, something ironclad to divert suspicion. Maybe he could claim he'd been out at a bar, surrounded by witnesses, drinking and laughing like a normal guy with nothing to hide. He had to maintain the illusion, to become the harmless, unremarkable neighbor who couldn't possibly be connected to the horrors hiding just behind his apartment's thin walls. The whiskey bottle on the floor caught his eye, its amber liquid glowing faintly in the morning light. The temptation tugged at him like an old habit, but he clenched his jaw and turned away. He couldn't afford the haze of alcohol clouding his mind, not now, with the police so close. Instead, he filled a glass with water in the kitchen, downing it in one gulp. The cold liquid slid down his throat, but it did little to soothe the dryness or the tension that gripped him. As he set the glass on the counter, he caught his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him looked like a ghost, hollow-eyed, pale, and frayed at the edges. He clenched his trembling hand into a fist, willing himself to get a grip. He noticed a smear of blood on the counter, a grim reminder of the previous night's chaos. Panic rose in his chest like a tidal wave. Grabbing a fresh cloth, he scrubbed furiously at the stain, the smell of bleach stinging his nostrils. The repetitive motion gave him a fragile sense of control, even as his thoughts spiraled out of it. He had to be thorough. He had to make sure every trace of his actions was erased. As he wiped the counter, the house's oppressive silence crept back in. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from outside felt magnified, echoing in his ears like a cruel taunt. The laughter he had hated so much was gone, but so was the small comfort it brought, the proof that life existed beyond his own crumbling world. Now, there was only emptiness. He paused, staring at the box on the table. The bright packaging, so colorful and out of place, seemed to mock him. Desperate for a distraction, he tore it open and pulled out the sleek new television. The act of setting it up felt mechanical, hollow. The vibrant screen lit up the room, but it couldn't fill the void gnawing at him from the inside. Ethan sat back on the couch, the laugh track of a sitcom playing faintly in the background. The irony wasn't lost on him, this forced levity juxtaposed against the reality of what he'd done. His hands rested on his knees, still trembling slightly, as he stared blankly at the screen. He was in control now, but the cost of that control was suffocating. And as the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, Ethan knew one thing for certain: he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Not ever. Ethan sat in his spotless kitchen, the faint smell of bleach lingering in the air. The TV in the living room flickered with the muted glow of a sitcom, its canned laughter echoing hollowly. He stared at the screen without really watching, his trembling hand resting on the table. On the floor, the whiskey bottle sat like a ghost of his former self, a grim reminder of the addiction that had dragged him to this point. Every creak of the house seemed to whisper accusations, the walls pressing closer as if conspiring to expose his secrets. The police welfare check earlier had shaken him, leaving him acutely aware of how close he'd come to losing control. Scrubbing the bloodstain off the counter had felt like scrubbing away his sins, but no amount of cleaning could erase what he'd done. Larry and Emily's bodies were still in the house, their presence an unrelenting weight that threatened to crush him. He couldn't stay here, not with evidence of his crimes hiding in plain sight. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He needed an alibi. Something solid. Something that would buy him time. His thoughts turned to his old drinking buddies, the ones he had alienated when his addiction took over. Could he trust any of them now? Would they cover for him, or would they be the first to question his sudden reappearance? His heart pounded as he picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the contacts list. Each name he scrolled past felt like a gamble, a risk. Finally, he stopped at one, Dave. They hadn't spoken in months, not since Ethan's drinking spiraled out of control, but he knew Dave owed him a favor. Taking a deep breath, he dialed, his hand shaking as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. A groggy voice answered on the other end. "Hello? Dave, it's Ethan," he whispered, his voice hoarse and unsteady. I need your help. Something happened last night." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I need you to say I was at your place. We had a few drinks, and I crashed on your couch. You don't remember much because you passed out, but that's the story, all right?" The line went silent, and Ethan's heart sank. Had he made a mistake? He gripped the phone tighter, his breath shallow as he waited. Then, finally, a sigh. "All right, man," Dave said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Whatever you say. But you owe me. Big time." Relief washed over Ethan like a wave, though it did little to ease the tension coiled in his chest. "Thanks," he muttered before ending the call, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. He had bought himself time, but he knew it was borrowed. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. The silence of the house felt louder now, each tick of the clock a reminder that his window to act was shrinking. Ethan's gaze drifted to the living room, the television still chattering away, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded. He couldn't let himself sit idle. The bodies had to be dealt with, and quickly. He needed a plan, something that would make it all look like an accident. His mind raced through possibilities, sketching half-formed ideas in the shadows of his thoughts. The neighborhood was familiar territory. There was the abandoned factory down the road, its rusted walls a perfect hiding spot. And the river on the outskirts of town, a convenient place for anyone who knew how to use it. He stood slowly, his legs feeling like lead, and took a deep breath to steady himself. The sun had risen higher now, casting sharp, angular shadows across the kitchen floor. The house was waking up, the world outside stirring to life. But for Ethan, the day stretched out ahead of him like a prison sentence, each hour a test of his ability to stay one step ahead. As he moved toward the living room, The weight of his actions pressed down on him, threatening to pull him under. He sat on the couch, his eyes darting around the room. The laughter from the sitcom felt jarring, a cruel juxtaposition to the grim reality swirling in his mind. The need to act was urgent, yet his body felt heavy, frozen in place by the gravity of what he'd done. His phone sat on the table, a silent accomplice to his desperation. The lie to Dave had worked, for now. But how long could he keep this charade going? The walls seemed to hum with tension, each creak a subtle accusation. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let it all fall apart. Turning off the television, he stood again, determination hardening his features. He needed to move the bodies, erase every trace of his crimes, and create a reality no one would question. Whatever it took, Ethan would survive. He had no other choice. Ethan stood in the living room, taking one last look around. Every detail, every corner of the room, felt like it was accusing him. The TV flickered silently, its glow casting faint, shifting shadows on the walls. The laughter from the sitcom was muted now, but it still echoed in his mind, a hollow mockery of what this space had once been. He sighed deeply, switching off the screen, and turned toward the basement. The weight of what lay below pulled at him, heavy and inescapable. The basement greeted him with the stifling stench of blood and decay. The water in the rusted tub was still, a dark, congealed red that seemed to pulse with the horror of what it held. Larry's body floated motionless, his features twisted into a grotesque parody of peace. Ethan's stomach churned, but he forced himself forward. He had no choice. The ticking clock of the morning pressed on him, and the guilt that whispered from every corner threatened to drown him. With shaky hands, he began untying the knots that held the soaked cushions in place. The water was warm and thick, clinging to his skin as he worked. The cushions were heavy, saturated with death itself, and they sloshed against the sides of the tub as he pulled them free. The corpse shifted slightly, sending ripples through the water that lapped at the sides like a macabre tide. Ethan clenched his jaw and turned his focus to the plastic bag containing Tiffany's remains. Each step to the alley blurred together in his mind. His thoughts raced faster than his feet, imagining every possible scenario of discovery. The shadows in the alley seemed to hold their breath as he moved through them, his burden dragging him down. The dumpster loomed ahead, a yawning chasm of darkness that seemed eager to swallow his sins. With a grunt, he heaved the bag inside. The plastic crunched against the metal as the lid slammed shut with an echo that reverberated in the still air. Ethan stepped back, his eyes darting around the alley to ensure no one had seen him. The sun was rising now, its harsh light piercing the shadows and laying everything bare. A siren wailed faintly in the distance, a cruel reminder of the world outside his nightmare. The coppery tang of blood lingered in his nostrils, mingling with the rank stench of garbage. He hurried back inside, the silence of the house suffocating him. The whiskey bottle waited in his room like a silent specter, tempting him with the promise of numbness. But he knew he couldn't give in, not now, not with the police already circling. He reached for his phone, his voice trembling as he called into work. "I'm not feeling well," he lied, his tone barely masking the tremor in his words. "Won't make it in today." With the call made, Ethan grabbed an old duffel bag and began packing. A change of clothes, his wallet, and, for reasons he didn't fully understand, the TV remote. The weight of his actions pressed on him with every item he stuffed into the bag. He glanced at the whiskey bottle one last time, its amber glow catching the light, and left it behind. It was a relic of the man he used to be, a man who could never exist again. As he moved through the house, the floorboards groaned beneath his feet, each creak a mournful dirge for what had been lost. He descended the stairs, the morning sunlight spilling through the windows, painting the walls in soft gold. For a fleeting moment, he let himself believe he could leave it all behind, that he could walk away and start fresh. But deep down, he knew better. The bodies would be found, the whispers would begin, and the truth would eventually claw its way to the surface. He couldn't outrun what he'd done. Not forever. Stepping outside, the cool morning air hit him like a slap. The laughter of children playing on the street echoed faintly, a cruel contrast to the darkness festering inside him. He walked to the bus stop, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. It felt heavier with each step, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. The hard edge of the TV remote dug into his side, a strange and constant reminder of the lives he had taken. The bus pulled up with a low rumble, its engine coughing faintly as it stopped. Ethan climbed aboard, the scent of diesel mixing with the sweat clinging to his skin. He moved to the back of the bus, sinking into a seat as the vehicle lurched forward. The city blurred past the window, a collage of concrete and glass, a world that continued to turn despite the chaos in his soul. The sun climbed higher, its warmth creeping through the glass and into his bones. Ethan's eyes darted around the bus, scanning the faces of the other passengers. To them, he was just another man, just another face in the crowd. But to him, they were silent jurors, their gazes heavy with judgment. His palms grew slick, and his chest tightened as the whispers of his guilt rose, drowning out the hum of the engine. He stared out the window, watching the city pass by, a quiet plea for anonymity burning in his chest. But no matter how far he went, the truth clung to him like a shadow. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the weight of that knowledge was a constant, crushing presence. The bus rolled on, carrying him farther from the scene of his crimes. But no matter where it took him, Ethan knew one thing: he could never outrun what he'd done. And somewhere, deep down, he felt it. Someone was watching. Ethan stepped off the bus at the next stop, his legs unsteady beneath him as if the weight of his secrets were trying to drag him down. The oppressive heat pressed in from all sides, the air thick with the pungent smells of exhaust and asphalt. The city seemed to twist and shift around him, a maze of concrete and shadows with no clear escape. He wiped a hand across his damp forehead, clutching the TV remote in his other hand like a lifeline. He turned into a quiet alley, its dim shade offering a brief reprieve from the sun's glare. The shadows wrapped around him like a comforting cloak, hiding him from the watchful eyes of the world. Lowering himself to the ground, Ethan leaned against the rough brick wall, taking slow, deliberate breaths. The whispers of guilt that had been hounding him grew softer, replaced by the first fragile threads of a plan. The remote in his hand wasn't just a trinket anymore. It was a tool, a ticket to something better. He could sell the TV for cash, just enough to get out of this place. The thought gave him a sliver of hope, a tiny ember glowing in the darkness. He thought of Jerry, an old friend from another lifetime, living in the next state over. Jerry owed him a favor, and Ethan could lie low there, far away from prying eyes and the looming specter of his crimes. But first, he had to deal with the evidence. The bloody couch cushions and the plastic bag containing what was left of Tiffany couldn't stay where they were. They were a weight tethering him to his sins, and he needed to be free of them. He dragged the grim remnants through the alley, his steps hurried yet careful. The dumpster loomed ahead, its rancid odor a jarring yet welcome distraction from the metallic scent of blood clinging to his hands. With a grunt, Ethan heaved the cushions inside, their waterlogged bulk landing with a heavy, wet thud. The plastic bag followed, the sound of its impact echoing in the silence of the alley. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving as he stared at the closed lid. It felt like a strange kind of burial, a final farewell to the life he had so violently dismantled. But the relief was fleeting. The distant wail of a siren cut through the stillness, growing louder, closer. He had to move. Hailing a taxi, Ethan climbed into the back seat, the TV remote still clutched tightly in his hand. The driver asked for an address, and Ethan rattled off a random street name, someplace he'd never been, someplace he didn't plan to stay. The car rumbled away from the curb, the engine's low hum a fragile lullaby against the chaos swirling in his mind. As the city blurred past in a kaleidoscope of color and sound, the whispers of guilt began to fade. For the first time in hours, he felt almost free. But the freedom was a mirage. Ethan knew the shadows of his past would follow him, that the lives he had taken would haunt him no matter how far he ran. He leaned his head against the window, the cool glass a small comfort, and began piecing together his next move. He needed to disappear completely, to shed his identity like a snake shedding its skin. Ethan was no more. He would become someone else, someone the world wouldn't notice or remember. The taxi pulled up to a pawnshop, its flickering neon sign casting jagged shadows across the pavement. Ethan stepped out, his bag slung over his shoulder, and pushed open the door. The bell above the entrance let out a sharp jingle, the smell of stale cigarettes and old, forgotten dreams filling his lungs. He approached the counter, laying the TV remote on the glass surface, its buttons worn smooth from years of use. The pawnbroker glanced up, his shrewd eyes scanning Ethan with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "What's the deal with this?" he asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the room's quiet. Ethan forced a smile, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "It's just a remote," he said, shrugging. "Nothing fancy. I just need the cash." The pawnbroker studied the remote for a moment, then nodded. $50, he said, sliding the money across the counter. Ethan took the cash, the feel of the bills strangely grounding. He stuffed them into his pocket and turned to leave, the bell jingling again as he stepped back into the morning light. The money burned in his pocket, a fleeting lifeline to the escape he so desperately needed. At the bus station, he bought a ticket for the farthest route he could afford. The line was long, filled with tired faces and weary souls, each person carrying their own burdens. Ethan stood among them, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of suspicion, any hint that someone might recognize him. But no one looked twice. To them, he was just another man trying to leave something behind. The bus ride was a blur of motion and thought. The world outside the windows sped past in streaks of green and gray, the city giving way to open highways. Each mile put more distance between Ethan and the horrors he had left behind, but the whispers of his guilt remained, quieter now but still present. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had a new name to create, a new identity to forge. He had to erase every trace of Marcus, the man who had done unspeakable things. But no matter how far he ran or how well he hid, Ethan knew the truth would always be there, buried deep inside him, waiting to resurface. The engine's hum and the soft hiss of tires on asphalt became a rhythm, a strange and temporary comfort. But as Ethan glanced around the bus, his eyes met those of a fellow passenger, a stranger whose face betrayed nothing but weariness. And yet, for a fleeting moment, Ethan felt exposed, as if the stranger could see the blood on his hands, the weight on his soul. He turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him, pale and haunted. The bus rolled on, carrying him farther from the city, but no distance could erase what he had done. The world might see a man on a journey, but Ethan knew better. He wasn't escaping. He was running from himself. When the bus finally pulled into the small town, Ethan felt a flicker of relief. The streets were quiet, lined with weathered buildings that seemed untouched by time. This wasn't a place where people asked questions or cared about a stranger passing through. It was the kind of town where life moved slowly, whispering of forgotten stories and second chances. As he stepped off the bus, the warmth of the sun contrasted sharply with the cold fear that had gripped him for days. He wandered into a local diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly above the door. The smell of greasy food and strong coffee hit him as he entered, grounding him in the present. The counter stools were worn, their vinyl covers sticky against his skin as he sat down. A middle-aged waitress approached without a word, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Her kind smile and tired eyes hinted at years of experience, the kind that had likely seen men like him before, running, hiding, broken. Ethan wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into his trembling fingers. He took a cautious sip, the bitter liquid scalding his throat but bringing a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to sit still, to feel the comfort of anonymity. But the moment didn't last. His gaze drifted to the TV mounted above the counter. The news anchor's voice was calm, but the images flashing on the screen were anything but. There it was, Larry and Tiffany's house, their faces staring back at him from old photographs. The word murder blared in bold text across the screen. His stomach twisted violently, and his hand shook so badly that the cup rattled against its saucer. He forced himself to look away, his breath coming in shallow bursts as panic clawed at the edges of his mind. The waitress noticed, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "You okay, hon?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Ethan forced a weak smile, his cheeks stiff with the effort. "Just tired," he muttered, pushing the coffee away. The light tasted bitter on his tongue. He couldn't stay here. Not now. The whispers in his mind, which had grown faint during the bus ride, roared back with a vengeance. Every second spent in this town felt like the noose tightening around his neck. He stood abruptly, nodding a polite goodbye to the waitress, and stepped out into the sunlight. The remote in his pocket pressed against his side, a small but unrelenting reminder of everything he'd left behind. He glanced down the quiet street, the life he could never have now stretching out before him like a mirage. The buildings grew smaller as he walked, his steps unsteady, his breathing labored. He couldn't stop. He couldn't let himself be found. As the town faded into the distance, Ethan spotted a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of the next town. Its flickering neon sign spelled out, "Vacancy," in an uneven rhythm. He approached the office cautiously, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The clerk inside barely glanced up, his face lined with years of indifference. Ethan slid some cash across the counter and took the key without a word. The motel room was bleak, peeling wallpaper, a sagging bed, and a television that seemed out of place in its pristine condition. He turned it on, letting the static hum fill the silence. The news droned in the background, but he couldn't bring himself to look at it. Instead, he stared at the cracked ceiling, his mind racing. How long could he keep this up? How far could he run before his past finally caught up with him? A sharp knock at the door shattered his thoughts, sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he approached the door, peering through the peephole. A young girl stood on the other side, clutching a plastic bag so tightly her knuckles were white. Her wide, frightened eyes met his, and she whispered, "Please, I need help." The whispers in his mind screamed at him to turn her away, to stay hidden, to move on. But something in her expression, something vulnerable, desperate, struck a chord deep within him. Against his better judgment, he opened the door, the cool evening air hitting him like a slap. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant, and used to kindness. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting down the hallway before looking back at him. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Please let me in." Ethan stood frozen, torn between the survival instincts that had kept him moving and the flicker of humanity that still lingered within him. He glanced down at the bag she held, then back at her pale, frightened face. With a deep breath, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them both inside the dim, suffocating quiet of the room. Whatever she was running from, Ethan could feel it in the air between them. And for the first time in days, he wondered if someone else's darkness might be even heavier than his own. Her story spilled out in pieces, a jagged mosaic of a life battered by cruelty. She spoke of her father, who had vanished without a trace, leaving her to endure a mother who had turned to drugs and the horrors of abuse. Ethan listened in silence, the sharp edge of her words cutting through the layers of his own despair. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of pity, something human, something he thought he had buried under the weight of his own sins. "Stay," he said softly, the words surprising even him. He offered her the small comforts he could, a bed for the night, a sandwich hastily put together from the scraps he had left, and the quiet sanctuary of his room. It wasn't much, but it was something. They sat side by side on the edge of the bed, the TV casting flickering light across the room. A mindless sitcom played, its canned laughter filling the gaps in their silence. She talked about her dreams, fragile hopes in a world that had shown her little kindness. She shared her fears, the weight of them evident in her trembling voice. Ethan listened, his own demons momentarily silenced by the steady rhythm of her words. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel something other than the crushing guilt that had consumed him. In her, he saw a reflection of himself, a soul adrift, struggling to stay afloat in a sea of chaos. Her voice became an anchor, pulling him back from the whispers that had haunted him for days. The room felt lighter, the oppressive weight of his crimes fading, if only for a little while. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her. Her head rested on his shoulder as she drifted off to sleep, her breathing slow and steady. The TV continued to hum softly, its glow illuminating the quiet room. Ethan sat there in the darkness, his thoughts racing. The warmth of her presence was a stark contrast to the cold grip of his guilt, but it wasn't enough to wash it away. He knew he couldn't save her. He couldn't save anyone, not her, not himself. All he could give her was this one night, a brief reprieve from the horrors waiting outside the thin walls of the motel. As the hours passed, the whispers in his mind grew louder again, creeping back like shadows at the edge of the light. They grew insistent, a chorus of guilt and dread that refused to be ignored. The glow of the TV became a mocking reminder of the life he had destroyed, the lives he had taken. The remote in his hand felt heavier now, a symbol of his fleeting control over the chaos that had consumed him. With a heavy sigh, Ethan stood, careful not to wake her. Her head rolled onto the pillow, and for a moment he watched her sleep. There was a peace in her face that he hadn't seen in years, not in her, not in himself, not in anyone. It was fragile and fleeting, and he knew it wouldn't last. He had to go. The whispers wouldn't let him stay. The past wouldn't let him rest. He moved quietly, gathering his meager belongings. The TV remote went into his pocket, its weight a silent witness to the connection he had allowed himself to feel. He slipped out the door, the cool night air stinging his skin as the neon motel sign buzzed faintly behind him. Its flickering light seemed to mock him, a beacon of the life he was leaving behind yet again. Above him, the stars sparkled in the vast darkness of the sky, tiny pinpricks of light that felt more accusatory than comforting. He ignored them, fixing his gaze on the road ahead. The whispers had become his constant companions, the voices of guilt and fear reminding him of the price he would one day pay. But for now, he had to keep moving. He had to stay one step ahead of the inevitable. The miles stretched out before him, an endless ribbon of black asphalt winding through the night. The TV remote in his pocket grew heavier with each step, its weight pressing down on his soul. It was more than just a reminder of the lives he had stolen. It was a symbol of the choices he still had, the story he could still rewrite. He walked into the darkness, his footsteps steady but his mind in turmoil. The whispers of his past grew fainter with each stride, but they would never fully disappear. Somewhere in the distance, the promise of a new dawn shimmered faintly, a fragile hope on the edge of the horizon. And as the night stretched on, Ethan clung to that hope, walking toward it with the echoes of his sins trailing behind him like shadows.